10 years ago, a fruit seller in a town in Tunisia set off a revolution. He set himself on fire, a fire that spread to almost a dozen countries. It destroyed dictatorships, it defeated armies, and gave people hope. 10 years on, that hope has faded into disappointment and disillusionment. Hello and welcome to Gravitas Plus. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay and I'm here to talk to you about the Arab Spring, a revolution for dignity and democracy that left in its trail violence and chaos. The story, as I said, begins in Tunisia. It's a small country situated at the northernmost point of the African continent. Tunisia was ruled by a dictator, President Zine El Abidine bin Ali. He'd been in power for 23 years of oppression and corruption for the people of Tunisia. And then something happened. On the 17th of December 2010, a street vendor unwittingly changed everything. This man was 26 years old. His name was Mohammed Bouazizi. He sold fruit on his cart. Local officials confiscated his cart because he did not have a license. He offered to pay a fine, but he was harassed, he was humiliated, and this is what he did. Mohammed Bouazizi stood outside a local government office and set himself on fire. He was taken to hospital, but 2 weeks later, he died. And by then, he was a national hero. The Tunisian people declared him a martyr. His act of defiance set off a revolution, something that the country had never witnessed before. Thousands of people who were suffering due to unemployment and paying for the corruption of government officials descended on the streets. They were armed with flags and cell phones. The movement spread on social media via Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And on the 11th of January 2011, a week after Bouazizi's death, the Tunisian government fell. The disgraced president fled into exile to Saudi Arabia. And all of this happened in a matter of just 7 days. Can you imagine the power of these people? Videos of the revolution went viral on the internet. Its speed and success inspired others across North Africa and West Asia. Protests began. First in Algeria, then in Jordan and Oman. By the 25th of January, the spirit of revolution had reached Egypt, followed by Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Morocco, Sudan, Kuwait, even Lebanon. All of these countries were engulfed in this revolution. More dictators were overthrown. On the 11th of February 2011, Hosni Mubarak was forced to step down. He was the man who had ruled Egypt for 30 long years, 30 years. Pro-democracy protesters coordinating on Facebook brought his regime down in a matter of days. Imagine the force of this revolution. By the end of the year, many governments had fallen. In Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh had to go after 20 years in power. In Libya, the powerful dictator Muammar Gaddafi lost not just his regime, but also his life. He was captured and killed by the Libyan rebel militia. The Arab Spring was a political tsunami for this region. At least 4 long-standing authoritarian regimes fell. The speed and surprising ease with which these regimes fell gave people a lot of hope. If removing a dictator was so easy, installing democracy should also be easy. Well, it wasn't. The transition was tumultuous. For some, it has still not ended. The revolutionaries have learned the hard way. Overthrowing a regime is much easier than building a stable new system. Tunisia, the country where all of this began, ended up being dominated by the interests of a small number of families and some rich businessmen. 10 years on, the country's economic machine is out of order. Tunisia is in a recession with zero growth. Reports say the recession could reach -7% by 2021. Tackling unemployment was one of the top goals of the Tunisian revolution. But as of 2020, more than 16% of Tunisia's people do not have jobs. Among the youth, unemployment is more than 36%, but Tunisia has some semblance of democracy. In Egypt, the setbacks outweigh the gains. The protesters failed to plan or politically organize after Hosni Mubarak's ouster. The power vacuum was filled by the Muslim Brotherhood. They swept to power and they established a hardline Islamist government in Egypt. That too failed. Their short-sighted, petty agendas alienated the public. The army in Egypt exploited all of this. The generals took power. They placed the country under a military dictatorship. There was another wave of protests. Another dictator was ousted. And now we are in 2020. The current Egyptian government, led by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, shows little tolerance for dissent. Some say it has been more brutal than its predecessors. What happened in other countries? The protests either subsided, the protesters got beaten into submission, or there was violence and chaos. In Libya, when Gaddafi's regime fell, there was little left of the Libyan state. The country collapsed into conflict. To this day, it is mired in a civil war. There are two rival governments and countless militant organizations. In Syria, the protests led to the worst fallout for everyone involved. A brutal dictatorship is targeting its own citizens. Citizens fled war and misery to end up as refugees. Extremists and terror groups like ISIS struck roots. Syria today is a disaster and still far away from democracy and dignity for its people. The same happened in Iraq. The uprisings were co-opted by terror groups like ISIS. When governments were toppled, rebel groups stepped in to fill the void. They resorted to strong arm tactics. They terrorized their own people. They stoked the fires of unrest. The civil war led to a massive refugee crisis which continues to this day. So were these revolutions ill-conceived? Or were they hijacked by another set of power grabbers? Was the Arab Spring a step forward or a step back for the people of these regions? Whose fault is it that they failed to get the life of dignity and equality that they fought for? The fault, we say, is in our understanding and our expectations of what an uprising can achieve. Democratic transition is not about the individual you overthrow, or the individual who triggers a revolution, or the individual who takes power later. Democracy is about institutions, systems which may appear mundane, but form the bedrock of stability: a free press, an independent judiciary, a corruption-free executive system. Getting rid of a dictator is not enough. You have to clear the systemic rot. You have to build robust institutions. Politics is hard work, sweat and grind beyond idealism. It's a lesson we often forget. America and its allies made the same mistake with Iraq in 2003. The removal of Saddam Hussein alone could not make Iraq a democracy. Conducting an election alone would not ensure equal rights for all. You need institutions. So let this be the enduring lesson from the Arab Spring for all of us. Strengthen institutions, not individuals.
Gravitas Plus, co-presented by Skoda. Simply clever.